All right. Good morning, everybody. Grade school's happening. It's Friday. I'm feeling good. I hope you guys are feeling good. I hope everyone can see and hear me. At the beginning of every grade school, I never trust that technology is working. For a person who makes their living using technology, you'd think I would get comfortable with, all the gear and mechanisms and stuff that you have in place to make the YouTube live stream really does work. But I always have that little nagging doubt. But I'm going to trust that everything is working and just say hello to all you guys and hope you had an awesome week this week. I had a really good week, really busy week. Lots of different stuff, but pretty much all of it related to what we're doing today, which is just messing with pictures, man, making the pictures pretty, working with people, trying to understand where they want to take things and helping them get there, designing tools to help you get there, communicating with others how we can get there, just living and breathing this, like color grading stuff. And it's a wonderful thing. So I'm really excited for today. We are going to have a bit of a different format today. As you guys can already see here in my Resolve, I've got a totally naked timeline of, let's see how many shots. I didn't even tally them. I can let my thumbnails load up too. So we got like 150 something shots. I don't know if we'll get through all these today, but what I want to do today is just grade through a couple of these scenes from this feature that I graded last year and talk you guys through everything from the way I set things up to my kind of ground level shot to shot process and answer your questions along the way of like, oh, what did you do right there? Like, how did you, why did you reach for this knob and not that knob? I want to spend our whole hour today just talking about how we would tackle grading this particular scene as a way of kind of grounding things in particulars. Because we talk a lot about big ideas and about abstract concepts on this channel, and I love doing that with you guys, and it's so important. But sometimes I think what's missing in our conversations is like, all right, let's get our hands dirty. Let's just grade a shot up and see how well these fancy ideas hold and how we actually solve our problems at the ground level. So I'm really excited to get into this with you guys, and I'm going to dive right in. Gadali, my good buddy, is with me as always today, so he'll be here to help field your questions. We are going to do, as I said, I want to be really focused today on this particular timeline. So if we have time and if other questions come up, I'm not going to say that's a hard no, but as much as possible, I'm going to try to prioritize our time on questions about working our way through this particular timeline. I really want to focus our energy and our efforts on that today. So with that said, I'm going to dive right in and you guys can ask questions as they come up for you. So first of all, by way of context here, as I said, I have a totally ungraded timeline here. This is what I would typically receive from an assistant who has prepped everything in for me. So obviously I have a locked timeline here, but I've done no color management. I've not done any project settings. I haven't touched this project up until this point. It's just been handed to me by an assistant who's prepped everything in, and I'm now ready to put my hands on it and set my table and then get into the practical shot level grading stuff. So let's work our way through it. And I guess the only other thing I would give by way of context here is I have had a conversation with my client and I know what they are looking to do with this material. So I feel confident that I'm going to be able to implement a look that I can at least put in front of them. I'm going to grade through everything, put it underneath a look and see what they think. And I'm going to encourage them in that first pass. I'm going to say, hey, for this first pass, if you can, think more about the macro than the micro. So don't worry so much about that window on that shot. We'll get there. Tell me more how this contrast feels, how this color feels, how this cool versus warmness feels. Kind of focus the feedback onto those more macro level characteristics, and I will tailor my look accordingly after that. But I feel equipped to set a good overall look to this based on the conversations I've already had with my client. So in this slightly hypothetical scenario, that's kind of like the state of the union at this point where I'm jumping in. So let's dive right into it here. So ungraded material, almost all of which is Arial XLog C. I think there's one kind of outlier Rec 709 shot. Yeah, it's the shot number 21. So we'll have to deal with that one separately. But I'm going to go ahead and set up my project level kind of color management right now. And as those of you guys know who've hung out in grade school or watched my videos before, my personal preference is to color manage in notes and using my group or my clip or my timeline grades as opposed to working at the project level. I could work at the project level, and there are really only a few trade-offs from one to the other. The main thing for me is I just like to see it. I just like to see the node that's doing my output transform. I like to be able to turn it off. I like to have that explicit visual of the entire journey of my image from sensor state to reproduction state. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with just establishing that color management before I get into doing anything creative and before I even go into my project settings. So I'm going to go to my outs power grades here. I've got a little power grade bin that's filled with different output transforms. Most of these are set up to target Rec 709 because that's still where I predominantly work, and at the very least where I will start my process. And there may be a supplemental HDR deliverable as well, or I may even be mastering in HDR. But as much as I wish it were the other way around, that's more the exception and more the cherry than the sundae, if that makes sense. I'm usually still working in a Rec 709 environment. So the first thing I'm going to do that's always a moving target is I'm going to play around with like, all right, based on what I know of this film and my kind of feedback, my vision, my take that I've been given by my creatives is we want to do a very subtly filmic thing. So we're not going to go like, you know, maxed out grain and slammed contrast and make it try to feel like we don't want to do an emulation thing, but we want to move everything into an elevated cinematic palette and you know, make it feel like a really, really high budget movie, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, I'm going to start by just auditioning a couple of different recipes for output transform. Most of these are set up to take me from log C, and that's what this material is. And my color management in this case is going to be a very simple form of color management where I'm just going to grade in my camera color space, if that makes sense. So I won't have an intermediate or a working color space like I might with something like ACES. I'm just going to work in that original camera color space because that's generally, I like to work in area log C anyway, and I use it as a working space even when my source isn't there. So in this case, it just makes my life simpler, and I've really just got one transform driving my color management. So I'm going to audition a couple things, and my kind of go-tos here are generally going to be Resolve color management. So I'm going to flip through and kind of see how my Resolve color management is feeling. And then, at least for most of this year, the sort of like the two that I would most consistently contemplate would be the Resolve color management versus the Aries log C to 709 transform. And I might even like, you know, if I have a couple stills that I feel like are kind of decent hero stills. You know, again, this isn't really a look because I haven't done any kind of look, but we'll see in just a moment that our output transform still changes the character of the image. So I do like to sort of explore the different options that I'm getting there at the outset. So I'm just going to try now resetting this and instead doing an airy thing. And if I compare one to the other, like so, we'll see that there's subtle differences. This is airy. This is, wake up, there we go. This is Resolve color management, and that's airy, okay? And I can kind of do this exercise on a number of these different images and just flip between them. I'm middle clicking to toggle in between and see what I like better. And this is usually a pretty quick part of the process for me. I don't want to dwell here for a long time. It's not really where I'm going to be establishing the look. I guess another way to put this would be, I want to make sure that the overall pipeline that I'm using supports where I want to take the image and it's not going to be fighting me from the get-go. And I guess the third that I would audition in here just for the sake of a comparison point would be ACES. And by the way, I could do the same color management that I was talking about of going direct from camera color space to display color space here in ACES. I could go Alexa for my input, and I could go output transform to Rec 709. I don't know if that's something I've done much for you guys in the past. Usually I'll go to the ACES recommended intermediate working color space, but in this case, I can just go direct if that's what I want to do. And let's compare this to my Resolve color management. So you can see like that's actually quite different if I compare those two. And what's interesting is ACES may actually be kind of a better looking starting point, but I know from experience that I actually like having a little bit of a more open contrast like I'm seeing with my Resolve color management. So, excuse me, so that I have room to add in my own creative contrast curve and my own look. So I really just bring in aces, not because it's something I'm often going to use, but because I wanted to give you guys a sort of comparison point of like just a seemingly neutral thing like an output transform can play a role in the character of your image. So it behooves you to think about these things, even if not on every project. From time to time, evaluate like, hey, what are my go-tos for getting from camera space to display space, and are they best supporting my creative agenda? So I'm going to go back to my Resolve Color Management, and that's what I'm going to live on from this point forward. And I should point out, for a lot of these kind of exploratory initial steps that I'm going through, I spend a little bit of time flipping through things and just exploring, like I mentioned. But once I set them, I'm not going to second guess. So I've decided on this color management. That's it. I know I can get good results out of this color management. I could have gotten good results out of any color management solution I chose. So I'm not going to be wondering in the back of my mind or auditioning down the road, oh, did I pick the right one? Maybe I should flip it around. I'm going to make that call right now, and I'm going to live with it. So it's Resolve Color Management for me. And next, I'm going to play around with my overall look for this entire film. And this is actually a good passage that I've kind of chosen on purpose for us, because we have a consistent look in terms of the lensing and the lighting style and the camera that it was shot on. However, we have a good variety of like environments and lighting conditions. We have some night car interiors. We have some night exterior over here. We have some day interiors, and then we're going to look, I think, at some further. Yeah, we've got some kind of morning interiors down this way, more night interiors, and then some more day interiors and a little bit of day exterior-ish stuff. So it's a good mix of material that represents the full range of different environments and moods that are in this film. And that's really the basis that I want to be auditioning my look on. I don't want to set a look that's like, man, that makes these car interiors look perfect, but everything else feels kind of flat. I really want to be auditioning my look on everything. So let's just play around with an overall look. And I'm going to tailor my process a little bit so that we don't have to rely on third-party manipulations, I think, because I typically at this point would use something like my colloid tools. And if I drop that on here, you know, you can see I'm getting what I like out of images kind of out of the box, and then I can go in and tailor those parameters to my taste. But for the sake of exploring this together, let's just kind of manually dial in a look, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to start with a contrast curve. And this is an important thing with look setting. I've talked about looks before. Let's grade. We want to start with our contrast curve. We even talked about this last week. And you know what? I'm going to go you one better, guys. I am going to use my colloid plugin because I want to focus more on shot level work than on dialing in looks. I feel like I could talk for an hour about manually building a look. I could spend a long time doing that. So I'm just going to take the great look that I'm getting out of my colloid tool, and we're going to grade underneath it, because this is a big part of my process, honestly, is being underneath a look that I really, really like. So with this tool applied, let's just flip through some shots. And all I'm going to be doing at this point, I'm kind of fast forwarding this look dev process a little bit because I've already got a look that I know and trust, or a transform, I should say. So I'm just going to be flipping through and making sure, like, all right, you think you like it. Is it breaking anything? Is it making anything feel weird? Is it problematic anywhere? And I'm just going to go and look at different shots and flip it on and off and make sure it's feeling okay. And so far, I'm not seeing anything that I'm worried about. Like in some cases, the extra contrast and thickness that I'm getting out of the look, it's your first impulse. We talked about this last week briefly. The first impulse might be like, oh no, we got to back off that contrast. We actually don't need to back off that contrast necessarily. I just know on some of these shots, I'm probably going to want to open up exposure, maybe a third of a stop. So far, nothing is really bumping me that I'm seeing here. The one adjustment I think I will make if I go a little bit deeper, let's look at these morning interiors. I think I'm going to look at this stuff. And I'm going to say, I could stand to do a little bit less split toning. Keep it in there, just do a little bit less. And then I'm going to let a few more of the original colors of the scene flow through. So if I turn this all the way to the left versus all the way to the right, you can see I'm kind of like confining things into more of a gamut of a traditional film print as opposed to the full available color gamut of an area-wide color gamut. So I'm just going to trim that back a little bit by eye and just see how that's feeling. Yeah, and so again, kind of fast forwarding through the look dev process, which I do when I'm really working. I usually will start with one of these and tailor them. And if we need to do something else, then I'm game to. But this is often my cheat sheet, my starting point. So I'm really happy with my overall look at this point, and I'm now ready to go and start thinking about shot level adjustments. And the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to build out a node graph. And this is going to be my stock node graph that will be exactly the same on every shot, so that even if my node graph isn't the same from project to project, when I'm grading through a film like this, which might have 1,500 shots, 2,000 shots, I can go shot to shot to shot, and I can punch up the number for any node in the tree, and I know where my primary is. I know where my balance is. I know where the exposure is. I know where the window I've got on standby is. All those tools are kind of at the ready in a predictable place. And so let me paint for you a kind of traditional or a typical node graph that I might build. So I'm going to do exposure here, and then I'm going to do a primary here. So exposure is just literal photometric exposure. Primary is going to be my contrast and my contrast ratios. I'm going to do a balance. That's where I'm actually going to play with ratios of red, green, and blue. I might do a Kelvin where I'm like, it's not really an RGB thing. It's just neutral color temperature that I want to photometrically adjust. And that's probably going to be about it. I might have some light noise reduction dialed in and turned off, something like this, where I'm doing spatial noise reduction, better, medium, labeled, and then just turned off and ready if I need to use it. And similarly, I might have a special prepared. That's not what I want. That shortcut got hijacked by a new piece of software. That's got to be fixed. I would do a empty serial node kind of at the ready for doing a little special to knock something down type of thing. So that's just kind of another standby node that's probably going to remain off until I need it. So that's my node graph, guys. Like it's going to be something like this. I might tailor it a little bit project to project, or if I know based on sitting with the client for an hour or two initially, like, oh, we're going to have to do a lot of this, I might tailor that. But this is the nuts and bolts of it right here. And there's a couple things that I need to do now to sort of ensure that my table is fully set before I begin grading. And you're going to notice I'm kind of like dragging out the process of beginning actual shot level grading. I like to do that. I like to explore and fuss around and like kick tires and really feel like, all right, I've got the ideal table set for myself, really sharpen my axe before I start chopping wood. Because I know once I start grading, I'm going to go fast, and whatever I've done at this sort of macro global level, I'm just going to get used to it regardless of how good or bad it is. So I might as well make it great before I start doing that shot level stuff, because I work really simple at the shot level. Like there's not going to be a ton more value I'm going to add at the shot level except to balance things and guide the eye and really dial things into a sweet spot. So I'm leaning a lot on my macro level processes. So what I want to do now is two more things. First, I'm going to go to my project settings, which I haven't even done yet. So I'm going to go to my file menu, go to my project settings, and there's just a couple things that I want to do here. This stuff is all going to be particular to your monitoring and all that good jazz. I'll make sure that I've got a valid directory for my stills and my caching and all that good jazz. And then the main thing I want to look at is my color management, okay? So as we already discussed, I'm not using any project level color management, but I do want to ensure that my timeline color space is accurately reflecting what I'm working in, which in this case is area log C, so that when I use the HDR zones palette or a couple of the other adjustments that I'm going to make, the proper information is being taken into account when I do that. So that's an important one. And then another one that I'll just always do is flip my 3D lookup table interpolation to tetrahedral. In this case, it doesn't matter because I'm not using any 3D LUTs, but if I were, I would want them applied in that form. And the last thing, super important for me, under my general options, S-curve for contrast, that's a no for me. I want linear contrast with my contrast knob. If I want an S-curve or a non-linear adjustment, I'll tackle that with different tools. You guys are going to see the contrast knob is one of my go-tos in this primary node that I'm going to touch on a little bit. So I want that to be, I rely on it a lot and I like it linear. I don't like it to be curving. Your mileage may vary. That's something for you guys to play around with, but that's where I've landed after years of fussing around with it. And I'm now officially set and good to go with my project settings. And before I start grading, how are we looking out there, Gadali? Does anyone have any questions thus far?
Yeah, we've got some questions around colloid in general, but also using presets. Like why use a preset? rather than doing it all from scratch, I think is kind of the general question.
Yeah, sure. So presets as in like saved stills.
Either save stills, power grades, or just using colloid in general to develop a look.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, the easiest way for me to explain that is I'm not going to show you colloid exactly. I'm gonna put it this way. I will very briefly show you this. So colloid is doing my own riff on what you would get out of a traditional film print. It's not the same thing at all, but it's doing something similar. And it's very particular. So this is what the curves of a traditional film scene referred film look is going to do. And this is what the cube is going to do. There's a lot of complex stuff happening in there. I don't build that stuff in Resolve. I build that stuff with like under the hood of colloid is a lot of code, like hundreds and hundreds of lines of code to bend and remap and curve and shape the image into a creative color space that I like. So that's not something I'm going to revisit on a project by project basis. In fact, I have an outer skin on my print stock designer that does allow me to kind of tailor things without getting quite so granular. But even that's not something that most projects have budget and time for me to go in and fuss with. So I have print stocks that I've invested hundreds of hours into making look fantastic. And I trust those print stocks like very, very much because I've put all that R&D into them. So I'm not going to revisit those unless there's budget and reason to do that. Of like, hey, we need a custom process for this that is totally different from the way I usually fly. Because I've got a triplet, FP1, 2, and 3 within my colloid. Those are designed to give me the full range of expressive tool that I would need on a given project. And then, of course, I can tailor things underneath them to a large extent as well. But those macro level, like remappings of hue and the contrast curvature and all that stuff, those are things I'm neither inclined nor able to tailor on every project. It's simply cost prohibitive, but it is important to me that they be really, really good and really well dialed. And that harks all the way back to the way that film print stocks were designed. This is how filmmakers made their images, polished their images for reproduction for the better part of a century. We relied on really good print stocks that once they were made, until the next generation of print stocks comes out, would you like the 2383, the 2393, or would you like one of a few Fuji stocks? It's a very short menu. They just all happen to be delicious dishes that are going to serve all of your images really well. So that's kind of the conceptual idea there. So let's grade. Let's get into it. The last couple things that I'm going to do in anticipation of my grade is there's a couple of things that by default, my working color space, pop quiz for you guys who are watching, what is my working color space right now? Think about it for yourself for just a second whilst I sip my coffee. I'm an Area Log C, right? Area wide color gamut, Area Log C. That's awesome. Big, huge color volume, lots of dynamic range, great space to work in. I actually like to do a lot of what I do with color, not in a log curve, but in a linear curve. That includes two of the nodes that we have right here, exposure and balance. So because I've now appropriately tagged my color space and my color management here, I'm going to right click my exposure and I'm going to set my gamma to linear because I actually want to make a linear exposure adjustment here. And on my balance, I'm going to set that gamma to linear as well because I'm going to get better results for balancing by working in a linear space. For that's my personal preference. It's not something you have to do, of course, but it's what I like to do. So those are my last sort of pieces of table setting. And all I'm going to do now before I dive in is ensure that I've got node number 1 selected. I'm going to select all my clips by hitting Command A, and then I'm going to middle click on shot number 1. And that's going to ripple out this empty template node tree onto every single shot in the timeline. And now I'm ready to rock and roll. And again, like I will probably after this first pass, when I put this up for my client, we'll have tweaks that are going to happen here at the global level, but shot by shot, I'm good to go. So let's just start scrubbing through stuff and seeing how it's feeling. Oftentimes on, like on any given shot that I'm at, I'll play through it a little bit, maybe less so today because I'm not on a powerful workstation, just on a little Mac that is not going to be able to do all this on the fly terribly well. But even more than playing through when I do have the proper horsepower, I'm going to look for the sweet spot. Where is the meat of the frame temporally? Where is the ideal moment in the frame? And that's where I'm going to park and that's where I'm going to do my work. So here on this exposure node, since I'm in a linear tone curve, I can use gamma, and that's photometric exposure. Okay? So I'm just going to start to dial those things in. So that's about it for there. And another important concept that I'll stress to you guys is because I've invested all of this time in fussing over my look and my global level settings, I'm not precious about like, oh, I need to make sure I really invest a lot of time in every shot. Like, I'm good on this shot. I'm moving on. And now I'm going to notice, oh, exposure needs to come down a little bit. Maybe not so much because they look okay. The window just feels a little bit hot. So I'll revise what I was going to say. I was going to paste this grade, but that feels a little too moody on her now. So instead, I'm going to skip over exposure. I'm going to say exposure is pretty good. And I'm going to go to my primary, and I'm actually going to still adjust gain, but gain's going to do something different because I'm now in a log curve. It's going to just adjust only my upper end contrast, like so. And I'm just going to make that little trim in the top. I'm going to flip my waveform over to a histogram because that's usually how I work. Maybe I'll look at that and kind of flip back and forth from one shot to the other and see how it feels. I don't expect my goalpost to be the same between a shot where I'm looking out a window and a shot where I'm standing in front of a window. But I do want to get a reality check and just see how things are feeling. And that's all I'm going to do here. I'm feeling great about that. Again, when I'm sitting with my client, they may say, oh, it feels a little bit green. And in that case, I'll go over to my balance node, probably start with my primaries bars and say, okay, well, why don't we add a hair of red or pull a little bit of green if that's what we want to do. Like so. One of the things I actually like about balancing in this linear mode is the wheels get a little less touchy. So I can kind of step on stuff without feeling like it's immediately going to be too far. So like nothing wrong with that adjustment right there if that's what my client wants to do. Off and then on. But I kind of like where it's sitting right out of the box. So I'm going to leave it until I get feedback that that's not what we want. Moving on. This is now facing the same side that we were facing a moment ago. If I had to guess, knowing this cinematographer and putting myself in the mind of the filmmaker, this is quite likely an evolution from this. It's probably the same setup. It's probably the same lens. Maybe not, but it seems likely. So I'm going to try out just pasting that exact same grade by middle clicking shot number 1. And I think that slots into a great place. Maybe I want to open up my contrast a little bit here because it feels a little heavy in the bottom. So I would work my lift here in the primary just a little bit, like so. Something like that. And I should probably have grabbed a still of this earlier. I'll probably go deeper so that I'm seeing how this connects up to what follows. And I'm just going to compare. How are we feeling? Hell yeah, I'm going to that movie. I'm loving that movie. I'm looking at my vector scope, looking at my histogram. Things are kind of living in an appropriate realm. Maybe go a little bit further with this opening of my lift. Not that far. Got a little bit of lag on my system here. There, something like that. Moving on. And now I'm going to do something you guys have heard me talk about before. I'm going to be middle clicking a lot. This setup is obviously the same setup as this. I'm going to middle click. I'm going to assume that the exposure matches. I'll grab a still of this, maybe for reference. That becomes my hero. And then I'm just checking to see that I don't need to make a localized adjustment. Same thing over here. Grab a still of this shot, wipe against the previous instance, grade pastes, moving on. Over to this shot, paste the grade. At this point, I'm literally just playing like Pictionary. And this is all just first pass stuff, guys. Of course, after I do this, I'm going to start it from the top and I'm going to press play and I'm just going to watch it. And I'm going to pay attention to how things are feeling. How are the cuts rolling together? What feedback have I gotten from my client? All that kind of stuff. But on the first pass, that's kind of like my process. And here on a shot like this, personal peccadillo, but I can see that I'm going to have to grade this setup, but I'm not really getting much access to her eyes here. They're not very tight to lens. And for me, that changes the way the image feels. And in fact, like this is a better example. Her eyes are tighter to the lens and she's catching different light when she does that because I'm not the only person who has that peccadillo. You know who else has that peccadillo? The cinematographer often. They will leave a sweet spot for when their talent is tighter to the lens. Not always, but often. So that's another sort of supporting reason for why I will kind of hunt sometimes and look for like, I really want access. I want to see into that face. And when I look at this, I'm like, I think that's a pretty great start, honestly. In this case, I actually feel like things feel a little colorful to me. Like, I love this big fat color spread that I've got here. I love how far reaching my vector scope is, but I do feel like I could do a little bit less of it. So I'm going to break my own rules of keeping it simple and go upstream. And I'm going to go to my curves, and I'm going to go to my loom versus sat and say, hey, as we increase our luminance, let's just trim some saturation. Like, don't let things get that saturated in that top end. So something like this. I'm going to go full screen, off, on. That's just kind of slotting those skin tones into a good spot. And I'm going to try with adjustments like this. I'm going to intentionally go far. I'm going to try to go so that I know I'm not going to go further than that. I might need to back off of that in my next pass, but I know I don't need to go further, because it'll be easy for me with fresh eyes to go through and go, oh yeah, what was that loom sat adjustment, and flip between them. And it'll be easy for me to see if it's somewhere in between these. That'll be easy for me to find. But if I haven't gone far enough, that's a harder thing to tune. So I'm kind of intentionally going to go a little far with this. And honestly, that's about all that I want to do here. Maybe just for the heck of it, I'll see if I can trim my exposure. This is generally something that I'm doing when I'm grading, guys. I'm kind of always trying to work negative. I'm trying to get things down. So I'm like, all other things being considered, can I lose a little bit of heat? Can I lose a little bit of stop? If I can, probably going to do it. So something like that. Let's see how we match. Let's paste that over here onto this shot. Let's look at the wide. Probably do the exact same jam on the wide. I'll grab this as my hero. Looking great. Now we'll look at the reverse. Probably take the exact same treatment, just a little exposure trim and a little loom versus sat. If I was a better housekeeper, I would label that so that I can see it at a quick glance when I'm going back through the grade. And that's going to be that little exterior setup here. And now we're going to look at what happens within this setup. This is an example where I'm like, all right, this is the tail of this shot, but this is a setup that I know from having watched the cut already is going to culminate with her leaning into the car window. So same thing, I want to pick the right frame to park on where I'm going to be doing my grading, and I want to ensure that I'm getting access to the talent and really feeling their presence. And that I'm also like, if I asked the cinematographer, what for you was the meat of this shot? What was the sweet spot? What moment were you lighting to? They almost always have an answer to that. And I try to make my best guess as to what that was. In this case, it's going to be somewhere around here rather than down here, where it's like, yeah, we have to geographically get her from the curb to the window. But I guarantee you, everything is lit to this, not to that. So I'm not going to grade this. I'm going to grade that. And when I look at this, probably the same kind of itch, honestly, that I was having before. I just feel like it looks great. I love that big fat color split. I just don't think we need to go quite so hard with it. So I think I'll skip that exposure trim that I made, because that's actually feeling fine where it's at. But I might go backwards just a little bit on that loom sat. Alternatively, we talked about this a little bit last week. I could turn this off, and I might contemplate, well, instead of trimming sat, what if I just warm everything up a little bit? I'm going to go to my high dynamic range palette, which is now color space aware and going to be reasonably photometrically accurate because I've tagged my work in color space. And I'm going to try something, again, like I'm going to go far. I'd rather go too far than not far enough. I'm going to try 750 degrees of warming, which is funny how little it actually moves this image. Let's go really crazy for a minute. And it's also funny if we audition, I'm going to wipe these stills. And if I audition bachelor number 1 of desatting highlights and bachelor number 2 of global warming, they're different, but the feeling, I'm kind of getting to a similar place because it's where my eye wants me to go. So I'll oftentimes at the first pass of a scene kind of audition like, all right, what are the go-tos? What are the adjustments and the tweaks, the look, if you will, for this scene going to entail? And I actually think for this, I might be happier with the saturation adjustment. So I'm going to leave this off. Go back to that saturation adjustment. I take it back again. Looking at it totally fresh, I'm going to do that Kelvin thing. If I'm on the fence, I'm going to go with the more fundamental, the more simple adjustment as opposed to the more primary or the more tweaky secondary adjustment. So that's going to be my tweak on this side of her single. And now let's look at this side. This one is interesting to me. So I'm going to try pasting my grade, and that's making things better. But this is another example where I'm like, all right, like the contrast ratio and the exposure and all that stuff, I'm not mad at any of that. That feels fine. But like, I want you guys to look here. Look at the vector of like this warm source that's hitting her here. I really like that warm, like golden kind of color that's hitting her here. I'm less in love with this more kind of yellowy hue that I'm getting here. So this is an instance where I'm kind of immediately going to say exposure, contrast ratio, balance, that stuff all feels pretty good to me. The color temperature adjustment that I tracked from the other side, that's working. That's getting me closer to what I'd like to do. But I'm going to kind of skip past that stuff pretty early in the process and say, at least on this setup, at least in this scene, I need a nice smooth way of getting this side of my talent's face to vector a little more goldy and a little less greeny. So the go-to for that for me would be either my, what the hell do we call it? The color warper, the spider web, if you will, or even more simply, just because I'm used to it, my hue versus hue. So I'm going to go over to my hue versus hue curves. I'm going to zoom in on him, sample a nice broad swath of that area of pixels, and I'm just going to start to rotate things upward and keep one eye on him, one eye on my scopes. Now, you guys have heard me talk about this before. As I'm looking at this, I'm getting what I want here, but perceptually, I'm going to end up with more saturation because I'm moving from a more secondary yellowy green to a more primary, getting closer to red hue. So as a result, I'm probably going to have to accompany this hue versus hue with a little hue versus sat. Grab that, drop it down. You can even see that tooth here in the signal of where the sat is kind of bumping. And so now when I turn this off and on, that's very sneaky. No one's ever even going to know I did that unless I audition it for them. But I like where this is vectoring much more. If I go, let's kind of zoom back out here and audition that. I think that looks much nicer. So like that's an example of where I'll probably pretty early, even though it's more of a secondary detail oriented thing, I'm going to look for a nice broad, soft way to get the note implemented early. That way I'm not calling a Hail Mary on the fourth pass and being like, hey, what do you guys think? Should we rotate the hue? Like I'll audition that stuff in early and I'll tell my client like, hey, I tried this in that scene and that in this scene, and let them give me their 2 cents and say, oh my God, that's great. Or like, no, dude, I lit it. I wanted it to look like that sickly yellow green. Put it back, you know? I'd rather get that stuff, that dialogue and that conversation and those experiments on the table early, as long as I'm doing them in a soft, sound way and not taking up too much time playing around with them. Let me pause for a second and hit some questions.
Okay, question from Eddie. Since HDR tools made the change to linear, do you really need to switch to linear as you did earlier for
Yes.
the tool, exposure tool?
Yes. Surprisingly, the HDR exposure, global exposure tool is actually still not a photometric exposure adjustment. It's very close, but it is not a pure, like photometric exposure is linear gain, full stop. And this is very close to that, but it's not quite. So I prefer to use the pure linear gain. And in fact, I'm tailoring things a little bit for you guys today. The way I really prefer to do exposure is with colloid exposure, because instead of thinking about a gain wheel, I can think super photographically and say, hey, trim a third of a stop. Something like that. So I'm not going to be doing that today, but that's my first choice. When I don't have that, I like linear exposure over the HDR global exposure, because exposure is the most important adjustment I'm going to make to an image. And I care deeply about the math that's going on under there and doing it in the purest possible form.
All right.
Let's hit a couple more.
EC Sanka asks, do you recommend working on the primary wheels or the new HDR palette using those wheels?
Different tools for sure. HDR palette is more powerful, more flexible. Primaries are more simple. It's entirely possible to break an image and make it look strange here. It's very hard to do that here, unless you're really just like letting your senses abandon you. These are nice, big, soft adjustments. As much as you guys hear me dog on the color correction tradition, there's a reason why lift, gamma, gain, and offset have been around and been the standard tools of color correction for its entire history. They're really good ways of manipulating, respectively, the bottom, the middle, the top, and the entirety of your image in that order. So those are, I would say, the burden of proof. I think about this concept a lot, that the legal term of burden of proof. The burden of proof for me is on the HDR palette. It has to show me it can do something I can't get with the primaries. Otherwise, it's the primaries, if that makes sense. Oh, let me pop out my vector scope. I see Anders give us that note there. I'll try to remember to do that. I can't make my adjustments when it's here, but you guys can't see it when it's there. So I'll just have to kind of keep rotating it. And now I lost it completely. Let's take one more Gadali while I figure out where the hell I put my scopes.
Okay. Zung asks why you've chosen to do noise reduction at the end of the note tree.
Noise reduction to me belongs there. Like I know there are people who are colorists who are really passionate about doing it at the beginning. I just don't understand why. Like for me, the fundamental thing to remember is that noise reduction is, despite what it's actually doing for us aesthetically, noise reduction is destructive to our image. It's actually beating up our image. It's softening and blurring it. And I want to have all of the original pixels, regardless of whether they're perfect or not. I want to have access to those pixels for the entirety of my stack. And then at the end, as necessary, in the smallest measure possible, kiss it with some noise reduction if I simply have to. But doing it at the head for me, I don't buy the logic of it. I don't believe that I buy the workflow logic of it, that your system will cache it off and you can work faster, but I have a perfectly fast system and I don't worry about that. So the workflow of it makes sense, but I don't think it's optimal for the image processing. Let me keep on trucking here. I'm sure there's lots more, but I'm gonna keep going. So, just kind of like moving fast through stuff now. So I've now got my heroes for both sides of this scene, and kind of like I did in the other, I would end up grabbing stills and doing what I showed you guys earlier, just playing Pictionary, rippling through, making sure stuff matches. I might choose at different points to go through and look at things in my AC mode. Like if I go to C mode, this will do things in record so that I can actually see the way things were recorded by time of day, as opposed to the way things were assembled in the edit. However, that's not like a magic pill for me, simply because it denies me the context of what's actually happening in the cut. So I might go back and forth if I'm like, all right, there's 60 of this shot. I'm going to flip to C mode real quick so I can just very rapidly ripple this grade onto every instance. But then I'm going to flip it back and try to be sensitive to context as I'm flowing through. So that's kind of the flow that I'm going to go through here, is just, rippling and pasting. Here's a shot we touched on earlier before. This is a piece of stock footage. And it's a piece of stock footage that hasn't had its comp done yet, so it's going to be tough for me to really gauge. But as a start, I can at least color manage it because it's being color managed like it's Arri log C, which it's obviously not. So I'm going to go to my ins power grades over here, and I have a preset for 709 to log C. And I'm going to drop it on. And now we're in the zone. We're somewheres in there. These I'll flip around a little bit. I actually like this as luminance mapping. And I'll sometimes do Rec 709A, Rec 709, Gamma 22. There's no wrong way to take display referred and put it back scene referred, simply because there's actually no right way to do it. Like, this is a conceit that I am indulging because I'd rather work on this image in my same unified color space and have it be able to receive my Arri log C look and all that good jazz. But it's an artifice to say, oh, I can explode a display referred 100 nit Rec 709 Gamma 24 image back out into Arri log C. I'm not going to get back dynamic range or color volume. It's just easier for me to apply a consistent pipeline once I do transform it. And then I'm going to take a very light touch going from here, because I know that I don't have nearly the latitude to work with that I would with another system. And actually, I think I liked my DaVinci mapping better there, because it's leaving that sign alone, which ultimately doesn't matter, but I find it distracting right now. And that's probably all I'll do here. Maybe a little kind of contrast trim or something like that if I feel like it's necessary to get a match back to over here. And kind of same thing, like I'll do this a lot, guys. Like if this is a shot we're cutting to from here, if I can connect up eye lines and feel the flow of the edit, that helps me. That makes it easier for me to just be an audience member and instinctively respond and go, oh, that's about right, or no, that feels bumpy. So in this case, I suggested opening the contrast, but when I look at it in this context, I actually would like to bump up the contrast, like so. So I'm going to work my way through this entire scene in that fashion. And then let's fast forward a little bit and take a look at the actual driving scene here. This one's fun. It's a really, really well shot, what you would call a poor man's process, if anyone is hip on their filmmaking and cinematography. So this is all on a stage, and there's a small army of production folks who are panning lights at regular intervals across the talent. And I think it looks awesome, but you'll notice the lighting conditions are very dynamic. They change a lot. So that same question of like, what is the sweet spot? What am I grading to? Pops up here. And this is absolutely one where if I'm in the room with the cinematographer and the director or the production designer or the creative team, I'm going to ask them, what were you lighting to? What to you was the sweet spot here? But since they're not here with us today, I'm going to make a best guess and say it's probably not when things are flying a stop over. You know, when I look at a moment like this, it's probably not there. It's probably around here where middle exposure is holding for me really nicely. And just to very briefly touch on the earlier question once more of like why I tend to rely on the same tools over and over again. One of the other things that I get out of like my colloid tools that I don't get out of rolling my own contrast curve by hand very quickly is I know from having built the math that middle exposure in to that colloid look is going to give me middle exposure out every single time. So that means when I'm making an assessment of what's the sweet spot of this frame, I can trust that what looks middle exposed to me actually is what was middle exposed. I haven't, with my stack or with my color management, biased middle exposure up or down. So I can use that as a very good clue in cases like this to say, well, find the middle exposed part and grade to that. And whatever happens above or below that, let's start with just letting it happen, because obviously if they didn't want the lighting to change, or they didn't want the exposure to go up or down, they probably wouldn't have programmed in all of that changing lighting condition. So I'm going to assume by default that the filmmakers are smart, that they know what they're doing, that they like what they did. And then we'll talk about it if they say, hey, I think I overdid it a little bit on that hot light panning across the side of her face there. We can animate and get as fancy as we want to, but I'm not going to assume that that's necessary or desired just kind of on spec at the beginning of the project. So I'm going to look at like, it's either going to be this kind of like darker mood here or something like this. And I'm going to grade to something like that. One of those moments in the shot. And to be honest with you, I just like how this looks. My only real adjustments here would be more kind of look level things of like, I could see my client maybe going like, come on, the contrast is a little heavy. Let's open it up a little bit. And I'd be happy to do that, but I think it looks inky and beautiful and filmy. So I'm going to let it ride. I don't see any need for overall exposure adjustment or a contrast ratio that is out of sync with what I'm doing elsewhere in the picture. So I'm pretty darn happy with that. And I'm going to look at, if I grab a hero on, a moment like this from this kind of profile angle, and I now look at when we bounce to the front, I'm just going to assess how that match is feeling at the global level. I think on this side, we do need just a little extra snap to get things to line up. So I'm going to try like a 1.05 on my contrast. Let's see how we're feeling there. I think we can go even a little bit further. Yeah, now we're making money. Not that far. There we go. Off, on, and match. So I would kind of store that as my preset for this. This shot's tricky. Again, paying attention to the evolution and the different moments in a frame. This one is going to turn from her single, at least in some setups, maybe not on this particular cut. In some cases, I know that this one shot, I'm thinking a lot about setups. I'm thinking a lot about what can I learn, what can I understand about the way this was actually photographed. I know from having watched this scene before and having asked the right questions of the production team, this setup is the same as this setup. And in fact, there's a shot in this scene where we pan from her to him. So I know that as a starting point, I should be able to ripple one to the other, and then I will adjust for the necessary variation from that baseline of doing the same thing, as opposed to what I might have done earlier in my career of going like, oh, okay, here's this shot and now here's this shot. They're actually the same shots, the same focal length, it's the same stop on the lens. It's a lot of the same lighting conditions. The frame contents and the subject have changed, but more has stayed the same than has changed. So I want to try not to introduce additional variables with my grade. I want to match and then deviate from that only as my eye demands, rather than starting with two completely different treatments of what's fundamentally the same frame in many ways. I'm going to take another quick break and answer some questions.
Okay, Jim is wondering, are you laying out your node tree for our benefit, or do you generally use a fixed node tree?
Fixed node tree, for sure. I haven't done much of it yet, except for like when I did that little sat versus or lume versus sat curve earlier. I'll add stuff onto this all day if I need to, but like this is my workhorse right here. And to be honest with you, depends on what I'm doing, but on a project like this, where like, I do a lot of features that take 3 to 5 days total, like with all the passes and all the notes and all that stuff. So I'm worried about setting a great look and making it feel awesome in terms of the overall pipeline, and then getting my fundamentals nailed, exposure, contrast ratio, and balance. And that's 90% of what I'm going to do on a movie like this. And that's plenty. That's where the money gets made on like making these images feel great. So above and beyond that, like the specials and the secondaries and the other stuff I can do, I'll take it as far as I can and do as much as I can. But I know that this node graph is where the biggest difference is going to get made in tandem with the look that I develop.
Cool. Douglas is wondering, do you sometimes find yourself using printer points instead of photometrically accurate adjustments, or have you banned them from your workflow?
No, definitely haven't banned them from my workflow. This is another thing that I'm maybe slightly adapting for y'all's benefit, but one of my go-tos, I've been a Kelvin person for a long time, but I've been using my printer points a lot more, simply because it took me a while to really grasp the reality that, like, even in my camera, even when I change my color temperature in my camera, that's a guess. There's only one color temperature sensitivity that my sensor has. It's around 5600. Everything else is a guess of what a sensor which was sensitized to tungsten would do under these conditions. It's a good guess because it's got good color science, but it is a guess. So ultimately, there's no like magic bullet of a Kelvin adjustment. So I've gotten a lot more lately into doing either a balance like you guys see me doing here, or a printer points thing where I'm like, let's just take add a 1/4 point of red, which in a negative adjustment style like I have here is actually going to pull red out of the image. And you'll see that here in the vector scope. Let's do it something extreme. Let me do a full point of red into the image. It's actually going to make the image more cyan. You can see that down there. But no, I've been doing, honestly, probably more points than Kelvin lately when it comes up, just because I feel like the magic of color temperature is kind of washed off for me, just because I'm realizing it's a good guess, but it's still just a guess, and there's no reason that my guess can't be solid as well. Edie, I got to fact check you there. I just happened to see it there. Check the documentation. I know what you're saying. It's very, very close, but it is not identical mathematically. They cop to it in the documentation. That exposure adjustment actually it has a little black offset down there at the bottom that does not, it changes from being a pure linear gain, at least as of Resolve 17.1. Let's do one more.
Okay. If there are any VFX clips in the scene, how do you deal with sending them to VFX artists, or how are they sending back in color space or other format?
Yeah, good question. So I would typically do that by simply changing my output transform. I would turn on, I don't even need to do that. I would just change the output transform to be, whatever. Maybe I'll make a copy. I'll turn this off and I'll say, hey, I need to give them, let's say I want to give them aces linear. First of all, I would ask what the what they would like in terms of that deliverable. But let's say it's aces linear. So I would just do aces linear, turn all this junk off, and then I would go over to my deliver page, and I would say, let's deliver individual clips. Let's, where is that? Let's bypass our flat pass so that we are, although I guess I would need that on. Yeah, it's been a while since I did that. I guess what I would do is turn everything off except for that final output transform. I'll revise slightly. So I would turn off my shot level grades, or maybe duplicate the shots that are being delivered for VFX into a separate timeline, leave them all naked, and just do a timeline transform to aces linear if they're not already in that format, which they probably wouldn't be. Deliver that, and then I usually try with VFX to just get an agreement of hey, I'll give you whatever you want, and you just give me that back. That way it's nice and clean and easy. So on the receiving end of things, I would then just change my input transform. I would add an input at the head and say, okay, they gave me aces linear. I'm going to go aces AP0 linear onto Area Alexa, Area Log C. No tone mapping, no inverse OOTF. Don't do anything. Just logify my aces linear. So that's how I would kind of handle the handoff there. And then we can talk at some other time about oh, can you give me a cool mat for the roto that you pulled on that person's face or whatever? There's instances where that's helpful too, but that's the basic handoff VFX assets to and from those vendors. I'm going to keep trucking, and we'll take a couple more questions after the next chunk here. So same kind of thing, guys, here. I'm going to go through quickly as possible, ripple things out, try to be sensitive to changes in lighting conditions. Like I again, am trying to, when I take on a project, I try to gather as much intelligence about the way the production went as I can. And I try to ask, like, did you have lots of time? Did you feel like you were finding the lighting and the exposure as takes evolved, or were you under more of an impetus to be like, light it and we got to live with whatever it is? Like there's those are all good questions to ask and information to know. So based on all that, I'm going to kind of apply my knowledge of the filmmaking process and just try to be sensitive to exposure changes or like angle changes or lighting changes, etc. In this case, the lighting and the compositions and all that stuff are quite consistent, so it's going to be pretty quick work for me. But that's kind of how I would work through this scene. Once we've parked, I'm going to try to take my same kind of hero of her angle from this side and just kind of keep it consistent, living in the same world. It doesn't have to be identical, obviously, but I'm going to try to keep it living in that same realm. So that's the idea there. And let's look at one more scene here, and then we're going to do some more questions because I think we've got lots of them. So we have here the next morning in the chronology of the movie, and we've got basically a series of overs that we're bouncing back and forth between. So in a scene like this, something that I haven't necessarily emphasized in the other scenes that I will look at here, so I'm like, okay, so we've got lots of these overs going back and forth. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I can see, okay, I'm going to do some stuff here. I'm going to be I'm going to do more than I've done maybe in the past couple scenes. So I want to be sure that I've got the maximum amount of context to do that in as possible. So I'm going to look for the widest possible frame. And in this case, there really are only a couple of setups and there's nothing crazy wide. But I'm going to probably look at Mom's looser side here because there's no frame size larger than that. And I'm getting the probably greatest variety in terms of the color palette and the contrast ratio. So that's going to be a good place for me to initially park and figure out, like, okay, what are we going to need to do kind of as a scene level? What is my scene level look or my scene level balancing going to be? Because I want to try to reuse that as much as I can. So if I look at this is another like great follow to our conversation we were just having of like, okay, is this a points thing or is this a Kelvin thing? I feel like in this case, this is an instance where I do feel like Kelvin is a better place to start, because when I look at this image, I don't know definitively because I don't have a raw format and I can't see what the camera was rated for. But what this feels like to me when I look at it is that the temperature of the key light and the temperature that the camera has been rated for are not perfectly aligned. Now, that may be creative intent. That may be exactly what the cinematographer wanted. They may have wanted a warm look. I often, in this first pass, something that I will do is I would like to show them neutral. I would like to bring them back home and show them neutral and say, here's neutral, here's where you were. If you dig that or you dig halfway back to that, that's cool. Or we can try warming in the tools that we have here in Resolve and just see if it's better, worse, the same. Just explore that. But it's really tough to have a meaningful exploration of something like a warm push in a morning interior scene until we've seen neutral, until we've seen balanced. So for that reason, I'm going to try to sort of like neutralize as opposed to like subjectively balance out. I'm going to try to neutralize what I am inferring with a best guess is a Kelvin mismatch. I'm going to try to neutralize that Kelvin mismatch, not because I think I've got a better idea than the DP did or that I think they necessarily made a mistake, but because I want to see a bullseye zero, and it's going to give me a better context from which to evaluate where we actually should place this on that Kelvin axis. So I'm going to go kind of hard with this. I'm going to go like negative 2000, and you guys will notice like when you have these big swings like this, it doesn't feel entirely photometric to me anymore in terms of the scaling. Like that feels like if I did minus 5,000 on the camera, I would expect to see more there. And in fact, I've maxed that out at minus 4,000, but I think that's a much closer baseline. And some of the clues that I'm getting there are that my separation is starting to come into play, and something else that I'll often do with balancing or with Kelvin. So I'm going to go to the end of the node stack, go to my primaries, go to my saturation, set it to 0, grab a still, delete that node where I desaturated everything, go back to my Kelvin and wipe onto something that should be whitish in the frame. So that this bowl would be a good candidate here. Let me just get my wipe kind of positioned in the right spot. And at least evaluate, like, okay, what is my balancing, my Kelvin adjustment doing? So it's getting me a lot closer. And in this case, I might just copy and paste this. I'm going to do Command C, add a new serial node, paste it, and that's now negative 8,000, which feels quite wonky to me, but that's getting me closer to a neutral white here. And if I zoom out, I'm like, okay, like that's more of a neutral white. That might not, again, I don't think that's going to be where we want to land with this scene, but it's helpful for me to be like, okay, there's 0, and let's grab a still. Or there's at least closer to 0. I can tell that with that little white balancing exercise, and I can also tell just by looking at the vector scope. I'm like, oh, okay, we were living entirely in this quadrant, and now we're living much more in a neutral place. And this is also like a little pinky to me as well, but I'm not gonna fuss too much over that. If I did want to, I could do some green gain over here in my balance, or I could do some tint over here in the Kelvin. Those are, or in this dedicated Kelvin node, I should say. Those are going to yield pretty similar results because it is fundamentally a linear operation that's being applied. But that's kind of where I would start with this. And then I would start to look at, let me go back and actually make that little tint nudge while I'm here. It needs to be -5. There we go. And yeah, that's going to be closer on my tint. So this would kind of be my baseline, and I would flip over to this side as well and be like, okay, here is this. I might have overly cooled it, but at least I'm closer to a neutral here, and I can say, all right, from this basis, let's explore this warming operation and say, okay, maybe instead of -4,000, it's only -2,000. Like that is starting to feel like a bit more of a subtle adjustment to me. So that would be how I would tackle a scene like this. I'm like, all right, I feel like I'm going to want to do more here than I might do in some of these other scenes where I'm like, oh, it's good. Kelvin's good. Exposure's good. Ratios are good. Moving on. A little bit more going on here, but this is going to be part of the beginning of a dialogue with the filmmakers, because I don't want to mess up their negative if that's what they wanted to do, but I do want to have a meaningful frame of reference for like, okay, we want to go what Resolve is calling 8,000 degrees warm. We can do that, but let's at least have a baseline reference so we can say this is what 0 looks like, and then we can find where the sweet spot is between those goalposts, if that makes sense. All right, I'm going to quit talking. Let's take some questions. That's probably plenty of live grading. It seems like we got lots of questions coming in.
Right. Joel is wondering, do you use linear for printer points as well?
I do. That's happening in linear tone curve.
Cool. Yash is wondering, how do you feel contrast? How do you, I guess, evaluate that contrast is the same between shots? Are you matching the scopes, or are you just going by eye?
Yeah, good question. I'll use the scopes as a reality check, but the scopes can really only give you your goalposts of like the very peak and the very bottom. The scopes can't give you curvature. So like the way contrast feels is going to be something you have to go by eye on. I want to get my ratios right, but I also want to get my contrast curve right. And there's just going to be shots that like, oh, there's less fill light in there, so the shadows crash into the floor. And I need to kind of scoop those out with something nonlinear while still pinning the bottom. I need to roll the contrast more in some shots than others. So that's kind of how I would answer that, is I'll use it roughly for like, all right, where's my peak? Where's my very bottom? And do they line up, or am I okay with the misalignment that I see? And do I feel like that's not being represented problematically in the image? But then beyond that, I'm going to really, in terms of articulating that curve, I'm going to go much more by eye. I love that question because it's one that I feel like I got a little misled on when I first started grading. I had like seniors and colorists who were above me who really beat into me like, man, line those things up on the scopes. That's really going to be your ally. And I've never found that to be that true. Like all you're going to get is a 1D, like All you can read from your scopes is this. Let me do this in a fresh node. Like your scopes can tell you this. They can tell you where the peak and where the bottom is living, but they can't tell you this. They can't tell you what the difference is between that or that, for example. Like, let me audition that in a different way. Like if I do, let's just do a practical example. If I do some crushing of my shadows, like so, grab a still. If I turn this off, and instead of crushing the shadows, I choose to do a roll. And I'm going to cheat and just kind of line things up on the image a little bit more. That was actually pretty close. If I evaluate one versus the other, on the scopes, it's going to look roughly the same, but it's not going to be the same in terms of the way that I am treating this image. One, I am rolling and compressing shadow detail, and in the other, I'm clipping shadow detail. And it's going to look and feel different when I actually look at the image, even though on the scopes, that's not like perfectly aligned, but it's pretty darn close. So that's how I would answer that. Let's do a couple more. Wow, that was the fastest hour I've ever done with you guys.
Yeah, went fast. Let's see. Anders is saying, I see the red channel sometimes clipping the blacks. Is that okay to do?
Yeah. You guys ever seen Boogie Nights when they're lighting the first movie with Dirk Diggler and Ricky Jay's cinematographer character comes over to Burt Reynolds. He's like, I'm going to need a few extra minutes. I got some really tough shadows to deal with. And Burt Reynolds goes, there's shadows in life, baby. That's how I feel about like clipping. It's such a crazy artifice to take all of this dynamic scene range and fit it into our like final image. Like I don't want nasty, like obvious clipping, but I'm not like opposed to it adamantly as long as I don't see it in the image. Like if you look at my curve back on my look level, my curve has a bunch of clipping built into it. Like there's nothing allowed to go below this in this. And up here in the highlights, there's nothing allowed to climb above that. So there's all kinds of like clipping or reduction or homogenization is more what I would think of it as. Like I don't think of it as like taking detail out and throwing it away, but I am compressing and homogenizing detail at the bottom and upper end of the image in particular in a way that I actually think is pleasing and really good. And that's a big part of what you're seeing when you look at the fact that we are really never hitting zero here, and we've got a kind of a cliff on the edge of these things. Like that's a big part of what we're looking at. Now, if we go to a darker scene like this, and if we were seeing like, like I wouldn't consider this even clipping, but if we truly were, like if I go onto the exposure on the shot and I get moody enough that I drop the exposure far enough, like that's the thing, I'm kind of bowling with bumpers here. Like it would be hard for me to drive my exposure far enough down that I'm truly clipping by my definition. It's like hitting the floor of my curve, but like my eye is going to be bothered a lot sooner than I'm going to say, oh, sorry, you guys. Oh no, you can see my scopes. Okay, good. My eye is going to be bumped a lot sooner than I'm going to go, oh, I'm clipping in my shadows and I better do something about that. If that makes sense. Let's try to hit two more.
Okay. Douglas asks, do you do any heavy light reshaping on projects where you are allocated more time? And if so, how do you approach it?
Yeah, I try not to. I try to. I'm happy to report that the longer I do this, the more I work with really good cinematographers who get what they want in camera. Of course, there's always that component of it, but I'm not that guy who's like on spec gonna throw a vignette on or whatever. Like that's stuff that's gonna happen after we get everything else slotted in, and once someone asks or once I'm like, what would you think about guiding the eye a little bit further in that direction. But what I would do in those situations, let's see if there's a good example somewhere in this timeline here. Yeah, I mean, like here's one we could take a look at. So let's get this shot on its feet. We just need to come in on exposure a little bit. And let's say that we're like, all right, my focus is supposed to be her. So I would say, like, as you guys have seen me do now, my priority when I set my exposure, my ratio, my balance is going to be my talent. So I'm going to orient everything around that. And once I'm happy with her exposure, I'm not going to put a power window on her and pick her up. But what I may do is go over to this dormant node that I have, set my aspect to 0, like so, and walk over here to this edge. And this is something else I will probably do in linear. Right click on my gamma, go linear, and just drop my gain. Drop the exposure on that portion of the frame. Big and soft as possible. Make it photographic whenever possible, and just like very subtly tame in that problem area. So there it is off. Let's do this real quick so we can see it. I have such a love-hate relationship with window outlines. It's like, yeah, I need to see it, but I also need not to see it. So that's kind of like what that would look like. And, you know, maybe I would walk it over a little bit so it's not whacking her shoulder. Maybe I would soften it even further so that if it does whack her shoulder, it's cool. But that would be, that's the type of shaping I do. As you guys who've hung out with me for a while know, I work really hard to work windows in a negative direction. I don't like to add with windows. I like to sculpt with windows. Let's hit one more question.
Okay. Ari asks, where did you start with grading, and what are your favorite learning resources?
You know, I learned kind of the hard way by doing and by like looking at a lot of stuff and developing. Like most of what I'm showing you guys, nobody gave to me. I just had to kind of figure it out. What I will say is that probably the thing you hear me referring to most and relying on most is an understanding at the basic level of cinematography and filmmaking. I'm not going to claim that I can do that stuff really well, but I talk to cinematographers a lot. And so I would say my best teachers have been cinematographers, whether they are, you know, like the guys in American Cinematographer who I haven't gotten to work with all of yet, or, you know, like the student filmmakers who I worked alongside at the beginning of my career, or everybody in between. They've all got like proven experience to share with you that they will share with you as soon as you ask. So they end up being really good teachers because they can give you intuitions of like, so much of what I've been talking about with you guys for the last hour is anchored in understanding photography and in trying to piggyback and onto and support photography and photographic measures, as opposed to saying like, all right, you're in my world now. Now we're going to start doing some saturation and some gamma and like all of this like color correction-y stuff that I feel like can kind of be a hairpin turn off of like the overall filmmaking process. It's kind of like in this odd other camp that feels kind of like a detour from what came before it. And I would say that was another big learning experience for me, is just like over time cultivating that observation that like, wow, I actually don't like a lot of the culture and the mindset that goes into doing this. And then going about the much harder question of like, okay, well, how can I do better? Who can I talk to about it? Who is doing good stuff? And I now have peers and colleagues, really, really talented colorists who I love talking with about these subjects, because they feel as I do that like some of the stuff that's foregrounded to us as artists are some of the practices and techniques that are most aggressively thrust upon us by whatever voices are out there and quite audible, are not necessarily giving the best advice. So I know that's not a great answer, but I would say learn filmmaking on the whole, understand cinematography really well. And that's been my best ally, that and just dogged curiosity of like, no, damn it, I want it to work that way. Why doesn't it work that way? How can I make it work that way? Well, man, that was really fun. I hope you guys got something out of that. I always feel really self-conscious just doing my craft and doing less lecturing and more demoing. But I hope that was really useful to you guys to kind of see how I work through the first pass of a feature. And I guess in closing, the couple things I would say is that you got to go into that first pass with a clear creative direction. You got to go into it with some trust and some buy-in, whether it's an old collaborator you've had for some time or a new collaborator who you've taken the time to sit with and help understand that you're going to take good care of their images and that you're going to honor their creative intent. You got to be at that stage. That's just as important as like, is the edit properly prepped and conformed in from the editor? That's important, but you also want to make sure before you start spinning knobs that you are sort of like relationally in the right place, so that when you give them that first pass, they are primed to receive it, as opposed to like you do that wrong and you send a first pass and doesn't matter what you did. It's different than what they've been seeing, and they don't yet have trust in you as an artist or a craftsperson, and there's going to be resistance, and they're going to see problems that may or may not be problems. It's just the lens that they're putting on everything. So that's kind of the really important wrapper that you want to put around these things. And we've gone a little bit over today, so I'm going to wrap it up fast and thank all of you guys for hanging out with me today. Thanks to Gadali for fielding our questions. And you guys can let me know here in the chat or leave a comment in the community panel and let me know if you liked doing this, and maybe we'll do another one down the line. But I'm going to sign off for now and wish you guys an awesome weekend, and see you for the next grade school. Thanks, everybody.